Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the BCG and GoResources Safflower Harvest webinar. We see there's a few people coming online now, and we're just about ready to go. So, for those of you who haven't been on a webinar before, it's a pretty basic thing. These panel discussions are pretty informal, and it's just a chance for growers to listen in to other experienced growers about their own attitudes towards the things we're talking about. And today it's safflower harvest. So, if you have got a question from the audience, those of you who are listening at home, just use the chat box function. I'm sure you're all aware of it. If not, it's down the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A or a chat function. Ask your questions in there, or use the raise your hand function, which is also down there to ask a question, and we'll throw to you live if you feel like asking that question verbally. So I'll hand across to Hudson now, who's going to introduce our panel and talk a little bit more about SHO Safflower, and he'll introduce the panel of experts as we go. So over to you, Rock.
All right, thanks, Tom. And on behalf of GoResources, I'd like to welcome everybody today to this webinar, which is on a pretty important topic, that is how do you get ready and go about harvesting your super high lake safflower. Why are we holding this webinar? Well, I think it's been pretty important. Last year, as many of you know, was our first year of introducing the crop. It was a pretty tough year, being a drought. That in itself brought about, a lot of challenges for farmers growing the crop. And those probably challenges were also borne out when we come to harvest time, when, the fact that it's a new crop, there aren't that many farmers out there, who've been around long enough to remember growing it. And so the area of experience that we've got around harvest was probably the area that we, was probably the weakest part of the system last year. But having said that, harvest went ahead, and what we observed is that probably about up to 25% of the samples that were being delivered last year had a lot of trash in them, both stalk, and you can see here, this is the sample from up around the Lockhart region last year. You can see it's full of a lot of admixture. You can see it's, stalks, the capsules, a bit of broken leaf and so forth. And obviously from when you're trying to produce a really high quality oil like we are with our super high lake, or for the industrial market, it's going to be really important that we're dealing with a really good clean sample that can go through the crush and then produce the oil that we're targeting for the marketplace. Conversely, you can look at this sample here. We did get some really good samples through. The majority of cases, this is from up near Rutherglen. You can see here that it's really nominal amount of admixture into the samples we're receiving. So we thought this year, and with the widespread early adoption of the crop this year, we've got crops this year all the way from Gundawindi in the north, all the way down through to the Western District in Victoria. And so obviously it's a challenge, a lot of different environments, a lot of different growing conditions, but at the end of the day, what we're after is a really uniform, high quality product to put through the crush, and so we can generate that oil. Safflower has been a crop, as many of you know, has been around for quite a while. And so it's a crop that was back in the early 1980s. There was a lot of it grown until canola took over. And so really what we're trying to do today is draw on a panel of people that have got a lot of experience in growing safflower. Our panel's made up of Mr. John Gilbert. John works for Adams Grains over in California, and I'll talk about John a little bit later. David Jochinke, who farms just north of Horsham, and has been farming safflower now for over 20 years, and has got a history even before that in doing some research in safflower. Tim Rethus, who has been delayed getting onto the call, but hopefully will be on soon. Him and his father and brother farm just outside Horsham. Tim's been growing safflower now for 4 or 5 years. And Sam Boyle, Sam's a farmer from up at Narrabri, but he's also probably more known around that whole northern New South Wales area because of his consulting work that he does. Sam's got a background in safflower. He goes back nearly 6 years. He was working for Calix, which is a research group that undertook all of our research development with safflower. And Sam's had a lot of experience in actually growing safflower in trial situations across a range of areas. But more importantly, he's had that experience in harvesting it. So Sam comes to us with that type of experience. As I mentioned, safflower has been around for a while. It's a crop that is really a new opportunity. It's a crop that we know is semi-drought tolerant, and also is providing, some unique advantages. And I think the fact the crop hasn't been grown for nearly 25 years in any scale, a lot of these advantages from an agronomic point of view have really probably the next generation of farmers aren't familiar with. And really, they're probably in a situation at the moment where they could be really useful. As I said, it's really a product. The market for this oil, and I think this is probably one of the pleasing things when you bring a new crop to market, is, and we often get the question, is it a real market or not? Well, recently GoResources has been working with an Indian company, for example, that's now placed an order for 15,000 tonnes of oil a year. What does that equate to? That's about 50,000 hectares of crop. We've also recently signed a 5-year supply agreement with a company in Queensland who are looking for our oil as well. Now, they're just 2 customers, but there's many more that we're working with here in Australia and internationally. So it's looking like it could be a very, very, very sustainable crop from both an end user, customer perspective, but also from, and more importantly, from a grower's perspective. I'd like to now just, move on to the panel discussion. And as Tom indicated, the way we want to run the panel, we've got a really good group of people here with a lot of expertise and a lot of real practical, down-to-earth knowledge of growing and harvesting safflower. So, I'm like the rest of you. I'd like to sit here and really listen to the panel, talk amongst themselves. So it's going to be a pretty open session. Talk amongst themselves about, what they see as the challenges, what are the watch outs, and how you deal with those when you're harvesting safflower. First of all, I'd like to introduce John Gilbert. As I mentioned, John's with Adams Grains, and they're a grain company based in Woodlands in California. I've been working with Adams now for nearly three years in safflower. They've got a breeding program, but also too, they have their own contracted growers to grow the crop, and also have their own crushing facility. So they're a fully integrated company, and John's been working with them for quite a while now. And I'll let John talk briefly about his history, and then I'd like him to start talking about, probably the real first question is, how do we know when a crop of safflower is ready to harvest? So John, I'll throw it over to you.
Great, glad to be here today. First of all, just a little background. I come from a family farm. My father farmed for many years. Once I was educated, went to college, got out of college. At that time, economy of farming wasn't that great in California, so I decided not to go into the farming business, but to work into the services of a farming agency. So I've been with Adams over 34 years, working as a field department manager. I'm in charge of their seed program, and also the procurement and buying of all the various crops, not only in the local areas, but also other areas of the world and country that we tend to buy from. So safflower is a crop that I've been around even back when my dad farmed. He used to raise safflower, so it's been around a long time, and I've been around it quite a while. I think the key to what Rock was saying is that we're you want to be able to bring in a good product, a good quality product into the point of destination of delivery. And safflower can be a little tough of being able to do that at times. I guess kind of what you look for are things you want to know when you're ready to go. Basically, when you're looking at your safflower plant, if you're out in the field, you want to make sure that you don't see any green in the plant. It's very, very important the safflower is harvested under 8% moisture. For more than one reason. One, from a harvesting standpoint, you can probably harvest safflower at 11 or 12% moisture and get it through the combine and be fine. The main reason for that is storability. The product, if you put it into storage for any period of time, because of the oil that's in it, if it has too high a moisture in it, it can go rancid, it can heat up and cause problems. So it's been decided that 8% is a good moisture to start, and it also, for crushing purposes, it allows to make the crushing a lot better. So the example here in the pictures, this is just from when Rock was out visiting us here last summer, I think it was, and we took him around, showed him a few fields. This is a safflower field that was, was being harvested. It's well past the point of being ready. I'd say probably this moisture on the safflower is probably 5%, somewhere in that range. But mainly what you want to look for is, like I said, the plant to be the green completely gone out of the plant. The earlier you can start on it, the better you are to get it harvested. You always tend to have a few weeds, which, as you can see with this field here, you've got a little prickly lettuce out there and a few other weeds that are scattered around. The amount of weeds that are there, though, that should not cause you any problem or any hindrance in with harvest. I think some of the samples Rocket showed earlier there, I know the first sample he showed was trashy, was very trashy, had a lot of pieces of the plant, the bracts, which is the little piece that's underneath the head, leaves and sticks, such as we're seeing here. Now, one thing that's a little more difficult when you do have a lighter safflower crop, if you don't have big plump heads, the heads seem to be a little smaller, which you can see in this picture. You see a few intact heads. It is a little tougher to get it harvested. But I look at the sample and my answer to seeing the sample is it could be better. It could be done better. The harvester could be set. I call them harvesters. Combines could be set better, as opposed to the sample here. You're always going to have, when you harvest safflower, you're always going to have dockage. There's always going to be a little bit of dockage in there, such as you can see here. You can see a couple of bracts. You can see a couple of stems. Those things aren't a big issue. You want to harvest safflower when it's dry. You like to keep your dockage. In our situation, we keep dockage 3% or less is like how we like to have it, just to bring it in and not only for storage purposes but for crushing purposes. So I think one of the biggest thing I think people do when they go to set their harvesters or their combines is that they tend to overdo it. The safflower head is one that's very interesting because it will sit out in the field and it really won't shatter. You can have some pretty good winds and stuff and you won't see it really shatter out of the head, but when you go to put it through the harvester, you can get it to go through the harvester fairly easy, and it thrashes out of the heads very easily. So what I tell everybody is what they're doing when they're setting their harvesters. The perfect world is when you get things set how you think they should be and the parameters are, and you want to get off the harvester, you want to go to the back of the harvester, and you want to take a look and see what's out there. And the perfect scenario that you would like to see is you want to see that head fully intact, cut off from the stem, basically. And in this case here, this is an over-thrashed head. You'd want to see that head fully intact, and it would look to you like it wasn't harvested. It will look to you like the seeds are still in the head. But if you lift that up and look inside, you'd find that all the seeds are gone. And that to me is kind of the telltale sign of that you're doing a good job. And one of the ways to do it, just general settings of your combines. I think in general people tend to run their cylinders or the rotors too high. When they run them too high, they tend to, as this stuff gets dry and gets really really down like 5% moisture or less, you tend to break things up. They tend to kind of disintegrate inside the harvester. So the more that you can kind of run that through the machine without tearing it up or breaking it up, the better you are. Because you can basically tear the plant up pretty good and not affect the seed. So as a general rule, I tell guys, you should be running your cylinder or your rotor at a range of maybe 300 to 400 range. Air tends to be in the range of 700, 800 on the air. Biggest thing with the air you have to watch is, depending on your crop, how heavy it is, how light it is. You have to be, because if you do have somewhat of a lighter crop, you have to be careful that you're not blowing it out the back. And if you get the air up over 1,000 or so, you definitely can do that. So I would say those are the main things. Your sieves or your screens basically are somewhat just kind of open to about 1/4 inch or so, which for me, I just use my fingers. I kind of see if I can put my fingers in between there. That's kind of my gauge to it. You try to get most of the product out the first time, out the back the first time, and not run a lot through the return if you can keep from it. Anything you run through the return, you're just allowing possibly the seeds to get cracked or broke up a little bit more. So those are kind of the general rules of setting the harvester or the combine, what you need to do, what you need to look for. It's not a difficult crop, but I think people make a lot of mistakes in their settings and tend to bring in the safflower that's dirtier like that. And that's part of my job. What I do out here in the field with the growers that I deal with is I'm running around all summer long in the harvest. When people set their harvesters, making sure they look good, going out and helping them any way we can. I think I don't care whether it's green paint, red paint, yellow paint, really doesn't matter. I think a person can take whatever paint he's running out there, and he can make it work, and do a good job. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Did you have, Rock, were there other things you wanted me to talk about, or?
Look, I'd probably like to throw it over to DJ and then perhaps Tim to talk about their experiences in getting ready, what they were looking for, and then perhaps the three of you and together with Sam have a chat about it.
Yeah, I do. Just one other thing I do want to add that I did forget about that I would like to add would be, which I think if you have been a person that's been raising safflower, is the extreme fire danger of your machine. The pieces of the head and the fuzz and everything that's in that head just will attach to everything and get on anywhere there's oil or anything around that harvester or into the air system. They'll tend to get in there. And if they get around a hot spot of your engine or something, they can sit there and smolder, and they can burn your machine up. And I as I always tell everybody, when you're done at the end of the day, make sure your worker or whoever's doing it stays around there for an extra 30 minutes and blows that machine off. So I've actually seen a situation where a guy went home at night and came back the next morning and the harvester was burnt up from it. So that's one other thing I guess I'd warn people, that if you've never harvested safflower before in your life, that's one thing you want to be very, very cautious with is if you smell any type of incineration that you think whatsoever, get off the harvester and look, because you probably got a problem, bro.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yep.
DJ?
Okay, so I've had experience both conventional with walkers and one rotor and two rotors harvesting safflower, and I really reckon it does start with what John mentioned about how ripe it is. A lot of the time we harvest overripe crops, which makes it really finicky to keep the sample cleaner. And also trying to avoid hot weather. The hotter it is too, generally leads to more trash breaking off with the plant. And noting that when you harvest safflower, you're not trying to smash anything, you're actually just trying to rub. So my general suggestion is, regardless of, once again, whatever make of header, if you can harvest wheat, you can harvest safflower with it. The two tricks is that slowing down that rotor speed and then slowing down the fan speed as well. So generally with the sieve settings and any other feeding settings, generally I've always suggest to start where you would with wheat, but just adjust those two other settings down. And as John also mentioned too, the ideal situation is when you rub that capsule out, it's still attached to the stalk underneath, and that capsule, it still has either a bit of the fibre or the particulates where the seeds sat in, still attached to that bud. That's when you're sort of getting down to the lower speeds. Now, noting that, I have blocked up a header once before from A to Z, and it isn't a lot of fun to pull that apart. So just keeping an eye on both your horsepower, capacity, throughput, as well as making sure that you've got your dad or your brother there to help you unblock it if it does happen. Some of the things like whip thistles we've seen in the past, and that comes down to weed management, and it does compromise your ability to harvest and or store afterwards if you do get heavy infestation of whip thistles or milk thistles. Noting that it's an Asteraceae, so same family as those plants. So it does make it a little bit more interesting to control. So that early control with either your pre-emergence or a brodal afterwards is pretty important if you've got a paddock that's potentially going to get away on you, because it will make it harder to harvest and store that grain afterwards. The other part about safflower and the fact that it can over-ripen is the way the capsule is structured as well. They do catch rain, So it is, timing is everything to get a good sample. Timing is everything to get a good product, because if you do get a decent rain, the moisture does sit in the head, and it does stain the seed, and that's especially an issue if you're growing the bird seed or the brighter seed, but also it can compromise the oil content in our oleic varieties, the super high oleic varieties that we're talking about today. So once again, ensuring that you understand when the crop's ripe and you can get onto it when the window is spot on, that takes a lot of the angst out of the frustration of setting up the machine, and then also getting the sample right at the back end. And once again, adding to that fire risk, I know depending on the season and depending on the conditions you're working in, if you've got a bit of breeze around your machine, it can keep your machine a little bit cleaner. If it's a still day and you're harvesting a decent crop, I've been known to just keep the blower back on the back of the header and just dust off the exhaust and the manifold at every boxful, just as a bit of an insurance policy, because those fibres can get stuck. And then also keeping an eye on your radiator, because those fibres are quite fine and do get in your radiator. So if you be mindful of which direction you're harvesting in, so it's blowing across the machine, not up and down the machine, makes a difference as well for those two reasons. And I guess the rule of thumb for me is when you're looking at the crop for it to be ripe, it is, once again, making sure that you don't have a lot of green left, but a pair of welding gloves is probably one of the best things that you can invest in when you want to go out and rub that head out. And just simulating, once again, between the rotor cage and the rotor, you just want to be able to rub that head, and those seeds basically do drop out quite easily when the crop is ripe. But if you're breaking it while you're doing it, if you're breaking the capsule, if you're breaking the stem off underneath, you're probably more in an overripe situation, which means that you then have to take consideration of possibility of harvesting in cool weather to help the sample, and or just trying to not over thrash things, making your window a little bit tighter. So in my experience, you can harvest it quite easily with almost any machine. It's just getting onto it when that window's there, and then also just setting up as wheat and managing your wind and thrashing.
EJ, you mentioned weather timing there in terms of a cooler day. And John, I know when we spoke the other day, we actually spoke about different timings during the day for harvesting. So is there sort of optimal times? I know you spoke about harvesting at night and getting your mindset changed a little bit from that Australian regular harvest. When you get into the safflower, maybe harvesting at night or in more dewy conditions can be a more optimal harvest.
Yeah, we do. We actually, that's one option that you can do if you get some pretty hot days, very hot and dry weather situations going. We do have people that will do it at night, and basically you don't really get any dew or dampness, but you do get a little kind of calming of the crop, I guess, a little bit, that it is a little bit not quite as brittle, and it also cuts down on the fire danger too. But yeah, we do that at times here when we get if we get situations where we're over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, during the day, then they'll either come in early in the morning. That's the other option. They might come in at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and start and then shut off at noon or something like that too.
Have you had the same experience, DJ? Or
yeah, look, on a 40-degree day, it's really hard to get a good sample. It's just, especially when the crop's a little bit more mature, and it doesn't take too long to have a run of 40-degree days that you've knocked off your harvest, Christmas has come and gone, and then you're starting to look at your safflower crop. So yeah, those days do make it a bit more trickier. As far as dew goes, because you're running your rotor a bit slower, if you do have a dew come in, you will hear your machine will start talking to you pretty severely. And if you don't listen to it, once again, you can get yourself into a bit of strife if you want to try to block it up or try to feed it too much in that scenario. That's once again when you got to make sure your siblings are around to give you a hand. The real trick though, regardless, is to know to pick when it is ripe, and to go not to wait too long, not leave it out there, because it's quite a hardy crop. Once again, it generally won't drop any heads. Takes a lot of wind. It's really only that rain exposure that you're leaving yourself if you do just let it sit. But the sooner you can get onto it, that means that it isn't as brittle and you are able to handle it more. But we have harvested at night when we've been in overripe crops, and we have harvested with a little bit of dew to try to help that as well, and that does assist with the sample.
Tim, you're a bit south of Horsham where you've grown your safflower. What's your experience in terms of knowing when it's ready?
Yeah, thanks, Rock. I was just going to add there, Rock. I think too that you've got to keep in mind, everybody, when you're harvesting this stuff, that you've already gone and finished harvest, and it could be several weeks later, and you are a bit in party mode, in holiday mode. So you just got to put yourself back into header mode. Don't just go and pick bankers hours. I found that when we first started in the morning, we had a fantastic sample, and exactly that John was saying, you were getting these white fluffy rabbit tail buttons out the back, and so your sample was beautifully clean because the heads were intact. And as the day warmed up, the conditions deteriorated. So just remember that it's still a crop like every other, and don't just sort of say, look, I've only got to do this one paddock. It's been 40 this week. I'm just going to hook into it. Just, you got time to choose. When I was looking for ripeness, and I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but I was waiting for those capsules to just look like they were starting to open, and then I knew the moisture was about right. I thought if it went, and that's generally when there's no green left. Is that a fair call, Rock or John?
Yeah, but in general, you know, as far as the head or capsule you're calling it of opening up, it generally doesn't really open. I mean, it pretty much stays whatever it is. So if you have a large size head, it'll appear it's open. It'll appear it's open because you've got more seeds in there, and it's kind of had to, the bracts around the edge have had to open up to absorb the area for the seed. If you've got a thinner crop or a lighter crop, smaller crop, your heads are going to be smaller and more intact. So it's not, I don't think the head really, I think from a concept of drying down doesn't really open or anything, but there is definitely a difference there on the size of the head, on the ability to be able to get that seed out of the head.
Yeah. And the other thing that Charles is going to mention is when those bracts do start making the head open up, that is when the higher risk is. And we haven't talked about it yet, but with the way the header front's set up, it was essentially being delicate because your reel is likely to try and stab those heads if it aims in the wrong spot, and that's where you're likely to lose some. So when we did it, we had drapers, and we tend to have the deck quite flat to accept those. And we didn't move too quickly because, as DJ said, you really don't want to block it up. The straw is, although it's very dry, the straw is also very tough. It's very, very wiry, great for staking tires and that sort of thing. So it is a bit of a load, but generally it's very dry and breaks up. So when you're trying to feed it in, it doesn't bunch up much. It's pretty stiff. So it's a bit like direct heading canola. And so I was just taking it easy and just trying to gently brush it in the front, but not trying to break the speed limit because I really didn't want to bung it up.
Yeah, and you're right about that. We had kind of touched earlier about that. How with the reel, you basically just want the reel to touch the top of the canopy and kind of touch it and bring it in as your ground speed is set to bring it in. Because if you start pushing your reel down in the crop, down the canopy of the crop, it's going to start dragging up. It's going to start pulling plants up. It's going to start wrapping, and it's going to be a big mess. So in most cases, yeah, you don't need to go down in the crop to get the crop into the header. You just need to touch it and kind of slap it in, I guess, per se, as your ground speed's going on.
Yeah. And the only other thing I was going to add, Rock, I've got limited power here, unfortunately, but I was going to add that the fire risk with ours, I think with the modern headers are pretty damn good. They've got different radiator designs, which are keeping it cleaner, and the exhausts, they've got a lot of attention to that, probably learnt from years of chickpea grower experience. So, yeah, I found with our machines, I wasn't at all concerned. The engine bay kept quite clean. But if you know your header is one that's is prone to a bit of a spark, then you definitely want to keep your eye on it. But I think, like I said, the modern ones, I believe they've fixed a lot of the issues, which is fantastic, and giving you a bit more confidence. But obviously, nobody goes harvesting on a 40-degree day.
Tim, you mentioned chickpea there, and we've got a question from the audience asking if it is like chickpeas and after rain events, the fire risk reduces. Is there evidence on that?
I would think that the fibres, chickpeas is more to do with mold dust and that sort of thing, but this is a fibre, so I would say it makes no difference. Is that probably fair, John?
Yeah.
Sam, you grow fair chickpeas up your way, and you've had a bit of experience harvesting. What's your thinking?
Sorry, Sam, unmute you, mate.
Unmute.
Sorry, guys. No, I was just saying I agree with Tim. I think that it won't make much difference getting rain on them. Definitely does with chickpeas, but I think it is more to do with the fire risk, really.
Yeah. Tom, one comment I'd make about the rain effect, and comment was made before. We had experience early this year from couple of spring sown crops down in the Western District from last year that weren't harvested till March, even into April this year, that because of the early rainfall we had this year, we had some really severe staining on the sample, the grain itself, and you could really see the difference just in well, you can see the sample here compared to the previous samples. This was from down near Cressy. You know, it was delayed in harvesting, and every time the poor old farmer looked like he was going to harvest it, there was a rain event, and as you can see, the end result was, you know, a lot of staining of the grain. So it is important that wherever possible, you know, if the conditions are right, and this is probably the rule for all crops, but just try and get it off as soon as you can. But in particular with this type of seed, you can see the difference there from Rutherglen. Same variety, you know, so out of the same batch of seed. So yeah, it's going to be really important. Probably the next question I have for the panel is in terms of, you've talked about setting, you know, getting the header set up properly. So the farmer's got the header set up, he's out in the paddock. What should he be looking for, you know, when he's actually out there driving the header around? And you know, what can go wrong? What are the signs? And then therefore, you know, what are the type of adjustments he could be making? You know, we've talked about the hot weather and adjusting your timer setting, but what are some of the other things that farmers should be looking for? Perhaps start with you, DJ.
Well, yeah, the temperature and the ripeness of the crop will determine where you're at. And as Tim said, the conditions do change throughout the day as well. So keeping an eye on understanding that you might be in your air-conditioned cab, but everything's changing outside. So how do you measure and make sure that you've got that under control? So the main three things is that rotor speed, making sure that you generally try to run it as low as you can. I'd even, we were talking about getting your rotor down to 300 to 400. I usually try to stick around that 300 as much as possible, noting just depends on how heavy the crop is. Once again, it's the rub you're going for, not the thrash. And then it's the how quickly you can get it out of the cage. Generally, with your rotor or cage selection, you try to set it up like you would a wheat, depending on an easier thrashing wheat, not a hard thrashing wheat, I probably should say as well. Either a small concave, then a couple of large ones behind that, or if you've got a wide machine, just make sure you pop your wires out the back a bit. You want to try to get that thrash in that first order of the rotor. That the distance between the two, you don't want things sitting in there smashing around too much. You want that gentle rub as it's going through the cage. So they usually, once you've got your concaves set up, you don't generally change them, but usually you go for a small wire, large wire, large wire, large wire if you've got that type of machine. And then with your wind, to completely agree with John before, you want to make sure that that air bed just keeps the seed above the fluff. You're not trying to blast the fluff out the back because you're going to throw the seed out. Seed is relatively light. In many ways, it's like you're harvesting oats at the back end of your the wind selection and how you set up your direction of your wind. So they're the ones that probably change as well. And then quite simply, the amount of material going through the machine too can have an effect of how much you're either pushing through that rotor cage and or how much your sieves will be able to handle it. If you've got a heavier crop, the material is quite light. So if you want to try to retain, be as productive as productive as possible within the paddock, generally you've just got to slow down your machine a bit to try to keep as much in the machine as you can, because it is quite light material. And noting with what Tim said about blowing down the machine, it's usually the areas that the wind doesn't blow past on the engine that probably is the more concern. So if you've got an exhaust that wraps around the back of your engine block and shoots out the back end, it's usually that last bit that would be the part that catches any of the hair. That first part's generally not too bad as far as keeping clean, because the wind of the radiator is usually strong enough just to keep that area clean. It's just the areas that the wind's not directly blowing on are more likely on the exhaust to catch.
John, any other comments?
Material going through the machine. what height would you cut it? Are you just direct heading it, or are you?
I've only ever direct headed. I don't know if John, you've got any other experience. I have had the question about windrowing once before, but it's another cost I don't know if you need to incur unless you've got some weed that you're trying to manage. Generally, you can either if you mow it off the ground, it is going to be quite wearing on your tyres. The longer you can leave it, and depending on which way you've got your lugs facing on your machine, it will wear down your tyres like a canola crop will if you cut it too short. And then it comes down to what you want to use the paddock for next year as well. That really is a key determiner. Generally, noting that safflower, it does take a bit more moisture out of your soil than probably some other crops. If you're looking at doing a hay or a barley, if that trash is going to interfere with you next year, you be mindful of it. But I always try to just cut it behind the first secondary branch as it comes down. So when you do cut the plant, you're trying to get most of the plant in with the one cut, not that you want to cut the branches off separately. You want to bring the whole plant in together. So depending on your year, depending on the size of your crop, I've had crops up to my chest. I cut it higher. If it's a bit of a drought year, you're probably cutting it down a fair bit lower. So it's not really a set and forget. You've just got to try to cut the whole plant off in one hit if you can.
Do you agree with that, John?
Yeah, no, I would agree. That's a pretty good assessment. I think I agree on the swathing part. I actually have had over the years, we've had quite a few fields that we've ended up swathing, and the purpose for in those cases we were swathing was because of weeds. We had a green canopy of weeds out there that was there. The safflower was dry, ready to harvest. We had pigweed, lamb's quarter, things like that were really bad, and because of the moisture in them. Using a desiccant to try to kill those weeds. If you've got a pretty good canopy of safflower, it doesn't work very well. It only kills the top. You can only get on the top and kill the top, and that's it with salt or something like that as a contact. So, and in our organic production, we do too. We do quite a bit of organic production for safflower oil. If we get into weed issues, we will swath it. Swathing, I found over the years, it's a technique you got to be careful with too. You want to use a draper swather. You don't want to use an auger in most cases because you'll thrash a lot of the seed out that we usually do. And then the other is you want to cut it at a level, maybe 6 to 8 inches above the ground if you can. It's all possible to do that so that when you do, it allows that windrow to kind of to land on top of the stubble, and it allows air to get underneath there to dry the product out. But that's the main reason main or only reason we really swath safflower would be in most cases because of weeds. That's all basically we do. As far as just normal harvesting of the crop, yeah, I tend to agree. Just you really need to take in what you need to take into the crop to get it in. But I agree there. Right below the branches is where you normally want to take it. You've got a 3 or 4 foot tall crop, and you're going to cut it higher because you don't want to get all that stuff in. And if you tend to go down lower in a high crop like that, you'll tend to have a tougher time getting the long sticks out of your sample, and it'll end up in the harvester tank. So I would, but then again, if you have a short crop, what I call a knee-high crop or less, something like that, you're going to be cutting pretty close to the ground because it's there. But I tend to agree with you on that completely.
There's one here for you, Rock, I think, to answer. It's from Tim. Does staining, which we talked about with the sample from Cressy's, does it matter with the SHO in terms of the oil products?
Yeah, good question. No, it doesn't impact on the quality of the end oil product. What we've seen in a couple of situations I mentioned last year where it has occurred is that we tend to get staining of the grain. But it doesn't impact on the actual oleic oil itself. That's once it's crushed and processed.
Oh, very good. Sam, we haven't heard a lot from you yet. Do you want to run us through the machine you're running up there and some of the issues you've seen, or some of the things you've noted in harvesting safflower in your life?
Yeah, sure. I guess from my experience has basically been small plot harvesting, so it's not directly comparable to a commercial machine in a way that it's just a single cleaning system with no returns or anything like that. So the setup is pretty different, really, in just that regard. But I think everyone's on the money with setting them up basically the same as we would with when we're going to harvest wheat. And yeah, just reiterating, just definitely have the crop completely dry, and yeah, just very gently rubbing the seeds out of the capsules, basically. So yeah, I think just setting up along those principles, you should be pretty right, because if the crop is right from our experience harvesting it in the trial plots, you know very quickly when the crop is either over or under ripe once you put a header into it. And because when you have it just right, it's actually very, very easy to harvest. So I think, yeah, just really important making sure it's dried down properly, and then yeah, just being gentle with the crop, basically.
John, the other day when we spoke, you had a couple of comments around the reel and grower experience in the States using a term that I can't remember at the moment. So they attached some pieces of wood to the reel. Is that
Battens.
Oh, battens.
Yeah, you're talking if the crop's wrapping on the reel, if it tends to wrap on the reel or something. What people will do sometimes is if they have the availability of a bat reel, they can put a bat reel on, which is basically just a metal, a tin reel there rather than having any teeth on it. The other option you could do is take your reel with the teeth on it and either put some thin plywood where the teeth are. You can cut plywood to the same dimension as the teeth and put it on there so it doesn't wrap, or also some belting. Some guys will use like a rubber type belting or something that you can put on there. And that generally, that tends to be with the taller crops, with the taller, bigger crops. If you have the shorter crops, you generally don't have that problem. But that's one of the things we've done over the years to help guys help with the wrapping on the reel. And then in most cases, like we talked before, you don't want the reel to go down in the canopy. You want to keep that reel and the teeth of the reel, keep them right on top of the canopy, just kind of flick or push the crop into the front of the header and not push it, basically. Just kind of help it in.
Well, have you got any final thoughts before we wrap this up? I know we've been going for about 45 minutes, and the audience.
Look, I think there's a question coming from Tim about desiccating. Just to clarify on that, so as John mentioned before, in the US, there's a number of desiccants registered for the use over the top of safflower as pre-harvest aids. At the moment, where we're at is that we're actually looking at that now to undertake some further work next year in order so we can drive some applications or some permits here. At this stage, it's not permitted to use desiccants prior to harvest because we certainly need to establish things like minimum residue limits and so forth. But it is an area in terms of the overall herbicide package that we're looking at. So it's a case of just watch this space, and when we know that information and have it available, we'll make it available to everybody. But just in response, Tom, I think that the experience and expertise that's been borne out today has just shown that it's not complicated, but if you get it right, you can get a really good sample. And of course, for everybody, that's really important because, as I mentioned before, it all is then reflected in the final product and the costs that are associated with harvesting and processing of the grain afterwards. So we're really looking forward to a good positive harvest this year. The crops are looking really good at this stage, and yeah, I think that's. And just finally, before you wrap up there, Tom, I'd like to thank all the panelists today. I mean, particularly John over in the US. It's he can knock off now and go and have his evening ale. And DJ, Sam, and unfortunately Tim, his signal's not that strong where he is at the moment. He's out working. So I'd like to thank everybody and also thank you, Tom, and BCG for putting on this webinar today, which I'd just like to remind everybody will be available as a broadcast later on. So perhaps if any of the panelists have got anything to conclude on, I'd welcome any final comments.
Probably just to finish off, Rock, I'd say when you talk about other grain handling gear for Safflower, anything you use for wheat, you can use for Safflower, augers, belts, silos. Once again, noting that when you're loading a truck, it does take a bit more airspace than other varieties or other crops. One of the key things though too is I found Safflower is always the one where you need to make sure you know what your marketing options are, or you have that all tied up before you grow the crop generally, because markets can be a bit fickle if you're not working with a company that you can move the product on in a timely manner. And then finally, it's just that understanding that if you are going to, whatever crop you're growing next in the rotation, that will come into play with your trash management if you're going to run a hay crop, or if you're wanting to grow something that's going to require a bit more moisture, just understanding that the plant does dry out the profile, and will have that residue of stalks do hang around for a fair while. They don't break down just over one summer. So noting those things as part of the package, but once again, if you've got a machine that can harvest wheat, you can do everything you need. If you're set up for grain, you can handle Safflower.
One question come in before we finish up, guys, about the bulk density of Safflower and hectares. Live weight.
We're asking the bulk density of it?
Yeah, bulk density, yeah, John.
Well, of course, I'll put it in the American way. Safflower, test weight of Safflower ranges usually generally from 38 to 40 pounds per bushel. So whatever you need to do to convert that, that's your general range.
Yeah. Look, the guide that we use, Liza, it's about the same as oats. So would you agree, DJ, around about the same as oats?
Yeah, when we're loading a truck, it's oats. Just pretend it's oats, and you're pretty safe.
Yeah.
I guess another way to put it, maybe easier to put it, it's about density-wise, it's about 2/3 of wheat. It's another way to look at it, I guess. So if you're looking to fill a silo or fill a truck or whatever, your volume of weight there, you're only going to get 2/3 of what you could of a wheat in there.
We find when we're packing our seed each year, this year we had 700 kilo bags of planting seed available, and that was put into 1 ton wheat bags. So that's about right, John. That about equates to about 2/3, 70% of wheat, and so that was about the measurement we had.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, guys. It's been really good to get some of the information out and available to the wider grower group. If anyone's got any further questions about Safflower, particularly around harvesting, Rock, anywhere they should be looking, or should they just be directing questions to the Bread Crop Group and onto you?
Yeah, just either go onto the GoResources website or do it through BCG, Tom.
Yeah, no dramas at all. And in terms of the agronomic package and any interested growers in being a part of the program into the years to come, Rock?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, would be, as I mentioned, we've been completing, as a lot of people know, we've had a pretty big investment into the agronomy around Safflower in the last 5 years, because we've really not had any major investment in agronomy in Safflower now for probably 15, 20 years in the southeast region. And it's certainly an area that we saw the need for. And so we've been doing work on plant time of seeding, and certainly we've been able to demonstrate that the earlier you plant it, the better the yields we're getting. So back at first week of May now as our general guide. Also from a weed control point of view, we've now got a range of herbicides that we've got minor use permits for. And as DJ indicated before, a product like Rotor will be one that will be, we've done the research now and we'll be applying for that next year. And we have other information which we've made available through on the website, but also to a number of groups now, and including BCG, are undertaking research work, and they included it this year in a number of their herbicide screens, so there'll be data available there. But certainly it's our intention to make our data available through through networks like BCG, but also people such as Delta Ag and Northwest Ag, who are our major suppliers in the market for planting seed and also manage the contracts for farmers. So if you are interested in a contract for next year or planting seed, they're the two organisations to approach. But certainly there's a need for more farming systems research, and that'll be an ongoing investment that ourselves and groups like BCG will be looking at over the next few years.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Rock. Thank you, John, DJ, and Sam for joining us today, and all the growers and agronomists and representatives who have joined us as an audience. We'll see you all again very, very soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
See you
you.
later.
Thanks, guys.